Christopher Weigel was a promising student at Boston University when he was killed while riding his bike on Commonwealth Avenue in 2012. 8 years later, at a ceremony in November, the scene of the crash was marked with a ghost bike, but it's also in the path of a legacy for bike travel. New protected lanes along the avenue, thanks to the efforts of bike advocates, the city, the state, and BU. To bring us up to date on recent gains and some ongoing challenges is one of the advocates, the executive director of the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition, Galen Mook. Thank you very much for being with us, Galen.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We'll start with the mood at this ceremony. We're used to covering ceremonies like this shortly after the fact. This is 8 years later in changed circumstances, maybe changed for the better here. So what was the mood like?
Yeah, great question. This is unlike some typical ghost bike ceremonies because this is actually a story of change and a story that details the infrastructure as it's been fixed. So usually ghost bikes are up to mark a dangerous point. It's a kind of a warning sign almost for drivers and bikers and just people out on the roads. But because the roadway now in 2020 is completely different than it was in 2012, including protected bike lanes, protected pedestrian crossings, easier bus access, and smoother flowing and slower traffic, frankly, this is actually almost a marker of what can be done in a legacy. And I hate to say success story for the advocacy, but it's a marker to say, that Christopher's death, even though the ghost bike is there to mark the loss of a life, and that is mournful, but put in the context of that this road has been completely redesigned for safety, in no small part actually spurred on largely because of the crash that took Christopher's life. We can almost mark this as a corner in honor of Christopher and to showcase that, this was a partnership that unfortunately did require, the sadness of a loss of life and the importance and the political power of a loss of life, but it really brought disparate partners together to really say, okay, we'll never want this to happen again. What can we do to our best ability to actually make the roadway safer? So the sentiments on Saturday were of, let's acknowledge Christopher and mark this corner for Christopher, but then on the other hand, let's acknowledge all the work that went in after the fact to get to where we are 8 years on.
Well, those lanes with those barriers of protection from motor vehicle traffic, they succeeded lanes with less protection for bicyclists. But if you go back even further, talk about the original situation when you had a lot of bike traffic and a lot of danger.
Yeah, I mean, when I first moved to Boston in 2002 and was riding those streets in 2003 as a Boston University student, I knew the dangers very well. There was no bike lanes. There was very little education and awareness from a driver's perspective that they would be sharing the roadways with bicyclists. And this, of course, is the heart of Boston University's campus, which brings in thousands upon thousands of new riders every year. I was one of them. And then also it's a major corridor. It's Route 20. It's an escape route for evacuations. It's a major truck route. It's a emergency vehicle route. It's a 57 bus line. It's a trolley line. It's thousands of pedestrians up and down Comm Ave every day. So it's a really convoluted and complex stretch of roadway that has a limited width. Now, the beauty of what we have on this stretch, though, is that because the institutional players of Boston University were able to step up and work with the state to get the funding and work with the city to get the design, that they all were, they all realized that the former anarchy, we'll call it, and dangers of Commonwealth Avenue really needed to be, we really needed to turn the corner there. And so, by having such a dangerous roadway in the past, we were able to get everyone on board to say, okay, what can we do to our fullest ability to make this as safe as it can be?
Well, I know universities generally want to stand up for student safety, but did BU really buy into this plan right away, or did it maybe take some persuading?
Well, like all bit of politics, there's a lot of internal conversations. And, there's concerns around funding of costs, the extended construction period, and the way that the finished product would actually work for the thousands of riders every day and the thousands of walkers every day and the thousands of motor vehicle and T-riders every day. So there really was a balance of interests. And I think the beauty of this project is, though we can mark it from my perspective as a protected bicycle lane, this really did improve all modes on Commonwealth Avenue, including for Boston University's benefit. And if you go to Comm Ave now, you'll see it's almost a promenade. The placement of granite benches, of landscaping, and the widening of the sidewalks, the improved street fronts for the facades. It really did, turn out to everyone's benefit. But to your point, Chris, that yes, it took some convincing, which is where the advocates really were able to step in. And the original plan was just going to repave and restripe Com Ave with just that single white bike lane with no protection, same dangers as it was in 2012. So, we actually, advocated very strongly, got the city of Boston on board. We actually took Mayor Marty Walsh, then recent mayor of about 2 months. I asked him if he would join me on a bike ride, and he did. We took him on Commonwealth Avenue so he could see firsthand as mayor, kind of the dangers of that roadway at the time. And, from that point, we were able to kind of work our way up the chain to get to Boston University. And the beauty I will say about this advocacy story is that it also came from the student body. So a lot of Boston University undergraduate students were a heavy player in this campaign, and that was able to actually influence President Brown, who arguably gets to make the call about what happens on campus.
When I look at the city's map of recent crashes, things look pretty good between the BU Bridge and Packard's Corner along the avenue, which is where these protected lanes are. But on the other hand, I look at Mass Ave. People have been concerned about it for a long time, and I still see all these indicators of crashes. That seems to be more difficult. Why is that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, every road in the Commonwealth has its own challenges, and it needs to be tackled independently. Has different interests, has different players, has different street widths and different feels. I think Mass Ave is a particular beast because it's such a throughway that cuts through so many communities as a lifeline, including being an evacuation route, emergency vehicles, along with all the college campuses that are along the corridor. I think two sides, a tale of two cities almost, if you want to put it that way, is to look at what Cambridge has done with Mass Ave versus what Boston has done with Mass Ave. And they're not comparable in terms of one for one, but Cambridge has been very bold in their stance of, if you've ever gone to the stretch between MIT and up by Harvard, Mass Ave is very complex and very convoluted. And the city of Cambridge is actually building protected, separated infrastructure along with bus lanes, which are bus bike lanes, and other kind of innovative bollards and paint to kind of separate and create some real physical separation between the bikers and the pedestrians and the motor vehicle drivers and the bus drivers. In Boston, it's a little bit more compact. So the city of Boston has been able to do that piecemeal where they can, specifically around Newbury Street. There's a couple of half blocks where the bike lane is able to go up on a sidewalk level, fully separated, fully protected, but that really is only about a block or two long before you have to mix back in with modes. And I think a lot of it is the challenges that a lot of our advocacy faces. It's based off of what is up for development at that time. And if there's a development on a corner, or if there's an institutional development on a small stretch, then we're able to actually get the advocacy involved to get the infrastructure fixed. But until some third party or some external force comes in to force a redesign, a repavement, a rebuilding of the sidewalk or a utility project, it's very hard to get the cities to actually commit to building out more robust protected infrastructure.
Well, the city has added some fairly robust infrastructure for bikes downtown, especially around the public garden. What we've seen so far might bring to mind picturesque family outings, but put this in the bigger context of what the city's planning here. This is not just about, mom and dad with the kids.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What we're seeing around the public garden and the Boston Common actually is probably over a decade and a half worth of advocacy that comes from the original Boston bike plan that was actually under Mayor Menino, which was then adopted by Mayor Walsh and kind of been pushed forward. We've been waiting to see if the city would act on their bike plan. I mean, they have a 30-year plan, which arguably we're, I think, 7 years in at this point, and we're a little bit behind schedule, so we kind of need to kick it up if we're going to get to the 30-year goal that we promised ourselves. But the Boston Common and the public garden were very important, crucial pieces of this, because for all of you who know downtown Boston, there's a lot of one-way streets. There's a lot of overbuilt roadways that separate the parks. And there's a lot of, basically, I'll put it, bad bikers who are going the wrong way in traffic because they don't have a safe alternative. So what we're seeing now is actually, in the face of a global pandemic, the city has what they're calling a healthy streets program, which is on par with what the state's doing with their shared streets program. And it's a way to think about our urban landscape so that we can create more space for people who are on foot or on bike to actually physically separate at a greater distance for COVID purposes. And so this was kind of a lowest of the hanging fruits, because for those of you who know Charles Street, for instance, it's 4 lanes of moving traffic and 2 lanes of parking that split our 2 best gems of a park. You know, Olmsted would be very upset to understand that there was 6 lanes of traffic separating people who were trying to cross from the common to the garden. So I think that this was kind of an easy one for the city to say, okay, well, let's start where the infrastructure is overbuilt, and let's start where there's a lot of people, and let's make sure that there is a safety for people to actually separate. And to do that, we might need to reallocate some of the street space, which, by the way, is public space, to reallocate it for people, not necessarily so much for car storage or for through traffic. And then partnered with that, we're seeing a lot of, well, it's actually way less traffic out there. So we actually have the ability to play around with more street space because there's less congestion, there's fewer cars out, there's less miles being driven. So the idea of, well, we can actually reallocate some of the pavement to give it back to the people who might be using it for necessary purposes. And I'll put an end to my rant with this, is that the beauty of doing it downtown is that it is both for the destinations of the common and the garden, and the public garden, but it's also for everybody who is passing through to get to the hospitals, to get to City Hall, to get to their offices downtown. I mean, that junction of all of the roadways of the way Boston is built, everything kind of meets all together right at the common. This was kind of one of those key nodes where all roads meet. And that was kind of obvious to say, okay, well, if people are going to be biking in because people might be wary of taking the T, we still don't want to encourage car traffic. So let's do whatever we can to actually make a corridor for essential workers to get to their jobs. And this was kind of an easy hit.
Finally, with the recent death of Ginny Chalmers, a bicyclist from Dorchester, I know there's still concern about protections of bicyclists from trucks, but you've got other initiatives as well. So if people want to keep track of that, is there a website they can go to?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The killing of Ginny Chalmers actually is also very tragic. She was a former principal of a school in Dorchester and really beloved throughout the community. And she was just riding her bike in the afternoon, and a right-turning truck driver, just, classic tragedy that we unfortunately see on our roadways around large vehicles. So one of the things we're working on at Mass Bike, along with our partners in the Vision Zero Coalition, is to enact legislation. So trucks that are in the Commonwealth, specifically leased and owned by the Commonwealth, but generally throughout, who are operating in the Commonwealth, if they're a large truck, they'd be required, the company would be required to put side guards on that truck. So if it's making a right turn and happens to strike a bicyclist or a pedestrian, that vulnerable road user, that bicyclist or pedestrian, would not get caught under the rear wheels, which we assume is what happened to Ginny, because that is what happens, unfortunately, pretty regularly with these fatal crashes. So that's one piece of legislation that we're working on with our Vision Zero Coalition. So I'll point people to visionzeroma.org, or you can go to the massbike.org website to check out our work. Or just Google Vision Zero Massachusetts, and you'll see some of the pieces of legislation that we're working on. Other pieces that we've successfully advocated for instance, would be the hands-free cell phone use while driving, which is a year old.
We know that. I've seen that on the list as well. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Great. I appreciate the time, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience.
Galen Mook from the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. We'll have more news in just a moment.